At this time, I'd like to introduce the speaker for this evening, John Brush. John gives me hope for the future of the planet. I've said that before, and I'll say it again. Okay? And like so many young adults that we've had the honor and pleasure of meeting for the last several years through the Native Plant Project, he has an eye for the future, which is well established in the past. In his research while studying for his master's degree, as well as the 10 years of experience as an urban ecologist for the city of McAllen, have enabled John to make some valid conclusions about our urban spaces. And they've also prompted John and his wife Stephanie to found a native landscape design business, which they call Prickly Pear RGV. Now the pear is spelled P-A-I-R. Although I find nothing prickly about either one of them, they're two of the nicest people you'd ever want to meet, and we wish them great success in their venture. So with that, I'd like to welcome our presenter for the evening, John Brush. There you go.
Very kind, Jan. Thank you. As always, Jan is too kind. But yeah, I'm really excited to be here this evening and share with you some stuff about urban ecology, and then also delving into some opportunities that I think collectively as an urban region in the Rio Grande Valley, if there's some willpower, we have the opportunity to pursue some of these things that are going on elsewhere, not only in the United States, but in other countries, to make our spaces better for people and better for wildlife. And I think for me, more and more, this sharing our cities thing, more and more, if I was going to summarize the conservation ethic to myself, I would say it's all about sharing spaces, right? It's about sharing spaces with other people and making room for them to thrive and grow and be whole human beings. And it's also sharing spaces with the other organisms that are on this planet with us, right? So sharing our cities, nurturing biodiverse landscapes. Let's see here if I can, that's forward. So more and more people are recognizing, there's still some, oh, it's a city, it's just a bunch of concrete and asphalt and blacktop and a lot of development and kind of everything is in shambles. But more and more people are recognizing that cities are multifarious mosaics, right? There's a lot of different aspects to a city. All these are different kind of styles of urban development, and all of them are within about 2 miles of each other in South McAllen. This is near Quinta Mazatlan. This is near the McAllen-Miller International Airport. There's La Plaza Malls, right? You've got a lot of commercial, heavy commercial, really, really full of impervious surfaces, right? But then, literally a block away, you have a cemetery that has a lot of trees and a lot of green space. You have kind of messy alleyways in suburban neighborhoods. We'll talk a little bit more about suburbia in the Rio Grande Valley. And still, we are still very much an agricultural region, both in terms of cultivated crops and as pasture for domestic animals. We have these open pastures that are there for grazing. Again, all of this just within a couple miles of each other. And of course, there's lots of other interesting microclimates in our cities as well. And our cities are already home to a pretty diverse assemblage of species. So these are numbers from my naturalist, based off of the different municipality places, right? So it's just a GIS envelope around a city. And you can see some pretty massive species richness in our cities, right? Mission, 4,000, McAllen, 3,000, Edinburgh, 2,000, Far should have more than that. I don't know if anyone lives in Far, but you gotta get your act together. Harlingen and Brownsville, all around that 2,000 to 3,000 marker, with a mix of species that are, South Texas emblematic species like the plain chachalaca, great kiskadee, introduced species like the brown anole, sickle-winged skipper here, queen butterfly over there. We'll touch on Turk's cap in a second here. So even though we're recognizing that cities are multifarious, right? And there's a lot of different land uses within what constitutes a developed space or a city space. Overall, when you look at a global scale, yes, biodiversity generally decreases with increasing urbanization globally, right? Here, what you can see here, that dot right there with the blue arrow is basically the Rio Grande Valley. This is the 1990 to 2018 population growth, and the valley is in kind of the top tier there for developing urban spaces. We are both an area that has coastal, right? You get over to Cameron County, Willacy County, we've got the Laguna Madre, we've got the Gulf, and then we also have riparian habitats, right? Whether it's along the Rio Grande itself or whether it's along its resacas, or now we've kind of extended the Rio Grande out into the Rio Grande Valley via canals, right? Like it's literally Rio Grande water. And there are kind of some interesting like secondary growth riparian areas along canals that can pop up when they're not mowed under. But so that's globally. That's at a large scale. At smaller scales, however, what's interesting is that you can actually have increases in biodiversity in urban spaces. And it really depends on the intensity of development, and it really depends on the taxonomic group that you're looking at. So this is from a big meta kind of study from McKinney in 2008. This was a paper I cited often in my grad school days. But basically looking at all these different studies of these different taxonomic groups and looking at the urban intensity and looking at like what was the most diverse, the less diverse, and the least diverse, right? And you can just see here, go through here, in the mid, you can see with plants, there's 2s, there's 3s, there's 1s, with beetles and bees and whatnot. There's, interestingly, bumblebees in Poland, mid amount of intensity development had the most species richness of bumblebees there. So there's a lot of differences in taxonomic group related to the intensity of urban development. So an example of this, why might this be? One idea is this idea called the intermediate disturbance hypothesis, right? This is something from John Marsloff, who's done a lot of urban ecology research on birds in the Pacific Northwest in Washington State. And basically, what you get when you have, they're in forest up there. So this is the percentage of forest in a landscape at 1 square kilometer. This is the number of bird species. So over here, where it's very little forest, that's very heavily developed, right? When you're over here at the almost 100% forested space, that's very undeveloped. So you get is this kind of bell curve of species richness going across what they call an urban to rural gradient there, right? So you end up with this in this intermediate level where there's some forest left, but there's also some city, is where you actually reach the peak. And it's thought that it's from a combination of things. It's from a combination of early successional species, which are native species that come in after a heavy disturbance in an area, right? In our context, think about things like sunflowers. Think of things in the aster family, Asteraceae, as an example of some of those early successional, along with some of our legumes, things like huisache and ratama and mesquite and things like that. You also have retention of native forest species, right? So things that are still existing in these undeveloped patches within the urban mosaic. And then you have the colonization of synanthropic species, syn with anthropic people, right? Species that are opportunists that we either intentionally bring or unintentionally bring into our developed spaces. So in the case of birds, that would be an example of house sparrow, European starling. Could also be great-tailed grackle. Could also be, and we'll touch on this in a second, some parrots and parakeets, all right? So that's kind of the idea of how, if we know that globally urbanization tends to lead to a decrease in biodiversity, how at a local level it can increase biodiversity. So here's an example, kind of putting into local context here, of some birds that I would call retention of native forest species: long-billed thrasher, olive sparrow, white-tipped dove. You can see these in urban woodlands like Quinta Mazatlan, like McAllen Nature Center, like Valley Nature Center, where we are right now, right? So even if you just have a relatively small patch of thorn forest retained in an urban place, you can still house these sorts of species. We've got our kind of this is not really an example of early successional species, but it's kind of that intermediate range where they're kind of what I would call an opportunistic species, where they can be in undeveloped places, but they can also be in developed places. So things like Kiskadee and buff-bellied hummingbird, and we'll touch on hummingbird again in a second. And then you've got your synanthropic species, right? You've got your house sparrow, grackle, monk parakeet. We have monk parakeet in the valley. I don't know if any of y'all have gone to Hidalgo. Near the pump house, you can see monk parakeets nesting. They make these big, massive colonial nests with multiple entrants into it. It's really cool to see. I'm actually going to skip over this. This is boring. But basically, the point being that there are some species. I did my master's work, like Jan mentioned. I studied birds, but I was also into plants at the time. But basically, you have some species. I had 55 sites that I did point counts at over 2 summers, including just standing outside of people's homes with binoculars. And yes, I got the cops called on me a few times. I had a bigger beard at that point, so I looked a little scarier, I think. I also probably was grumpy because I was a student and I was tired. But there are some birds that I would have pretty much every single point, and there are others that were only in relatively small numbers of these sites that I visited. What about plants? This is a native plant project. What are some plant trends in cities? Foreman is a well-known urban ecologist, and he has a cool book that my parents got me a long time ago that I still sort through and read on occasion. It's a good going to sleep book, but it's really, really interesting, and it's full of lots of information. But basically, urban areas are a mixture of native and non-native species, and this has been going on since cities have been a thing, right? People have been moving plants around for basically as long as people have been moving around, is probably the easiest way to summarize it. One cool example that I always will go back to, because I've had the opportunity to go to some of these forests, is that these Mayan forests, this is, I believe, at Calakmul in the southern Yucatan Peninsula, but all that forest, there's trees growing up out of these pyramids, right? And you're like, oh, this is wild. This is like nature reclaiming land and everything like that, right? Well, it is. Not to say it's not, but a lot of the tree species that are in and amongst these Mayan ruins are kind of leftovers or descendants from Mayan gardens, Mayan cultivated spaces, right? So what we see and what we perceive of as being wild is in fact a legacy effect of people in many regards. So urban plant examples in the RGV, right? It's a mix of native and non-native species. Some of the really common ones are things like the Washingtonian palms, right? We plant them. They also spread on their own. Things like honey mesquite. This is a native species, but is definitely increased with European colonization into the area. And then people will plant vitex. I don't see vitex that just kind of propagates on its own that much. I'd be happy to hear if anyone else notes that. But some people are like, it's really invasive species, and I'm like, I don't know about that. I've never really seen it go crazy. Turk's cap, this lantana, either Striga camara or camara. Tomatoes will go kind of wild around. Scarlet spiderlings, that was a lovely little plant. Ruelias and frog fruit. These are just some examples there. I do want to touch on that our choices in our cities, kind of leading into some opportunities here. There's Turk's cap again. But one of the outcomes from my thesis work, along with earlier bird counts that Dad and I did, is that you're actually way more likely to see buff-bellied hummingbirds in cities than you are in natural environments. And it's probably because people plant a lot of hummingbird-friendly plants in our cities, and we put up hummingbird feeders. Interestingly enough, there's a recent study out of California that showed that Anna's hummingbird, their bill is actually changing its morphology, thought to be in response to the abundance of hummingbird feeders. They're also staying longer in the winter, specifically in cities, because urban heat island effect, probably. And they're expanding their range north, probably in a combination of climate change plus some urbanization stuff. So what we do in our spaces really does impact wildlife. And cities can be havens for rare species. I know there's a red-crowned parrot roost somewhere right around here at Valley Nature Center I know they have some nest boxes around, but this is a great example of how in our urban places, you can have some really like globally endangered species living right outside your doorstep. So this is a IUCN Red List endangered species. Anyone know what it's eating there? It's a coral bean. Normally I remember seeing them eat the green coral beans, the undeveloped fruits, but then I found this photo that I took that I had completely forgotten about, and I was like, that one's eating a ripe fruit, which I thought was interesting. But it's thought that there are as many, if not more, red-crowned parrots in cities in the U.S. than there are in Mexico, or their quote-unquote native range, right? So we can absolutely house rare species and do conservation of these rare species in our city spaces. I thought this was just a fun quote. There's a Texas Monthly article that came out not that long ago about red-crowned parrots and parrots here in the Rio Grande Valley. Definitely encourage you to give that a read. Here's another example, not from the Rio Grande Valley, this is from Florida, but this butterfly, the Atala butterfly, was considered extinct in the US in the 1950s, but now there are more than 300 colonies, and it's because people are planting this cycad in their yards to serve as basically little reservoirs, little sanctuaries for these butterflies to reproduce. Really beautiful butterfly. So not only are cities important for, or can be important for housing rare species, and I know a lot of us in this room love to have some rare plants in our yard, but urban areas are also really, really valuable for biodiversity because that's where people live and where people are spending most of their time. And where people are spending most of their time is where they're making their connections, right? And so the value of biodiversity in cities is summarized by this pigeon paradox that I always love going back to. It's alliterative, pigeon paradox. I love pigeons. I have two in my backyard that I keep. But basically, these three general assertions. One, current conservation is insufficient. Not super arguable there. People are more likely to take conservation action when they have direct experiences with the natural world. And as human populations shift to cities, people will primarily experience nature through contact with urban nature. So what we do in our cities is not just important for preserving diversity in our cities, but it's also important for preserving diversity outside of our cities, right? Because when people make that connection, whether it's to a pigeon or a chachalaca, from a little yard mallow to, I don't know, a Walker's manioc that someone has in their yard, the connection matters. The connection to nature matters and can inform who they vote for. It can inform what things they put their money into outside of the city region. All right, let's do switch up a little bit here and talk about some of the context of the RGV landscape change. So, quick run. The red and pink is urban. That's development. Varying intensities of development. You can see as you might presume, the deeper the red, the more intense the development. This brown is cultivated cropland. So you can see it's really a lot of that delta region, right? And then there's a lot of dry land ag when you get up into Willacy County. And then this yellow is like pasture, grazing land, and then that tan that you see a lot on the north side and then out west, that's like thorn scrub environment. So it should be, I would show it as green, but we're going to show it as tan here. This is the National Land Cover Database. This is an open access tool that you can get into. So what's been happening? You can go back and look at this sort of image going back to 1985. So I decided to look at what's been going on in the Rio Grande Valley from 1985 to about where we are today. And what's been happening is kind of interesting. There's obviously an increase in development. There's a pretty noticeable decrease in ag pasture. So a lot of times, you can see it just when driving around the valley, right? What used to be an orchard is now a suburban development. A lot of the ag pasture is going down. But it's interesting that the forest scrub is kind of increasing, and it's probably a lot of secondary growth from like ag places, or I would assume, no, I have no evidence of that, but ag places, and potentially also U.S. Fish and Wildlife has been doing restoration since, the 80s as well. So there's some conservation there going on. What about within the developed RGV? What's been happening? What's interesting is that the low intensity, over here, by the way, is square kilometers. And then this is the year down below. So there's been a lot of increase in low intensity development. And I'll show you what that looks like in a second. And then percentage-wise, a big increase in high intensity, but it's still not that big of an area relative to that low intensity. So basically, how I would summarize this is sprawl, right? This is basically sprawl. We're going out into these, what were ag fields predominantly, and turning them into, bit at a time, suburban development and then commercial development mixed into that. So this is an example from near where I grew up in Edinburgh of what it looks like to have developed open, which is this one. That line, those dots, is developed open. And then this is the low intensity, medium intensity is the gray, and black is the high intensity. So I'll just flip back and forth a little bit here so you can make some connections of what it would look like aerially versus what this different development like intensity looks like. So golf course right there, that's qualifies as developed open space. Oops. You've got this lighter pink here, which is that developed low intensity. So that's like some suburban neighborhoods that aren't like super packed in housing wise, right? They're bigger yards, so there's more green space available. Let's go back and forth again. We've got the red, so that's a higher intensity. So there, you can see that's a really compact development, right? A lot of houses with not as much yard space. And then you've got the high intensity, which is gonna be down here. That's like Echo Hotel area in this part of Edinburgh. Sorry, I keep doing the wrong one. That's high intensity. So that's just an example of kind of how I got those numbers and what the aerial image looks like. But if there was a summary, is that in our urban areas, in our developed spaces, we have a lot of plantable space. This is a very, very common sight in urban areas. Vast expanses of mowed grass, right? Probably some other herbaceous plants mixed in, but a few scattered trees. It's the urban savanna look is another name for it, right? Scattered trees, grassland, but the grass isn't allowed to get taller than 12 inches typically. Hidalgo County metro cities average about 40% grass or herbaceous cover and only about 16% tree or large shrub cover. I know this is preaching to the choir, but I think about this a lot. I think about water use a lot when I'm driving around, and I see people watering their lawns at 4 p.m. in a summer day, and it just about gives me a heart attack. But about half of our Texas municipal water use goes to grass-dominated landscaping, which is absolutely ludicrous, if I'm being frank. Like, what a ridiculous use of potable water. St. Augustine grass, which is the one that most people turf their yards with, is absolutely the wrong choice if you want to turf grass, because it takes 35 plus inches of water a year, and the RGV only averages 22 to 24 inches of water a year, which means that you have to want to keep it alive, you have to continually water it and water it and water it. If you're going to do a grass lawn, just do Bermuda, because it doesn't take as much water at least. So, what should we do with all that space that we have all this grass, right? Well, one thing that we can do is plant tiny forests. This is something that I've had the pleasure of working with other people on. There's a lot of partners involved in these. But we're transforming this urban savanna look. This is on South Ware Road. Interestingly enough, I was looking back at old aerial imagery. This used to be a little side ditch of a canal, and Ware Road, apparently going back to the late 90s, was like a much smaller road. And then sometime in like 98, 99, it was expanded to be that 5-lane road and Palmview Community Center. But before that, there wasn't that much development south of that in McAllen, apparently. But with tiny forests, what we're doing is we're turning that into that. And this is just a matter of 2.5 years of growth there. It's hard to see in this image, but that's what it looks like when you're walking through it now. And we planted all these things from those plant band sizes that you see over on that table over there. So we've had the pleasure of doing these in a few different places. There are other municipalities in the US that are doing this. There's a city in New Jersey that's done it. There's some California cities. There's some Massachusetts cities. And then it's much bigger in Europe and in Asia than it is in the US. But this is 2 years of growth, grass to thorn forest, basically, in a matter of 2 years. That's Tepewahe in there. There's some Ratama in there. There's another example of just about a year and a half of growth in McAllen as well. So the idea of these tiny forests, I'm going to go back to this one because I just like looking at that image. But the idea is basically you do a really high density planting of a very diverse assemblage of species. So typically we aim for 30 plus species, and it's about one plant 24 inches on center. And you do it in a semi-random fashion, which basically means that I kind of have an idea of where I want to put things, but then I don't want to impose my opinion too much, and I want the plants to figure it out based off of the local context and based off of random chance. Probably the easiest way to summarize it is that you're essentially trying to greatly increase succession. So you're trying to go from that blank slate to a forested habitat as quickly as you can. And so what we do is we plant early successional species like Tepewahe, like Ratama, like Wisache, but we also plant slower growing species at the same time. Fast growing species go faster, make a little favorable microclimate for those slower growing species, and you end up with pretty fast growth down the line. This is an example not from the Rio Grande Valley. This is from the desert of Tucson, Arizona, but this is a forest in Tucson where they get like 10 inches of rain a year. We get, in Hidalgo County, it's 23 inches of rain a year. So we get more than double what Tucson gets, but look at all that beautiful vegetation there. The Watershed Management Group and the Dunbar Springs Community Foresters do some really cool projects, and I'll show you another image here in just a second. But all these things, well, first of all, there's a home right over there to the left. This is in a neighborhood. This is where people live. This is the sidewalk that people walk down to go from space to space in their community. But these are planted in basins, shallow basins, and how they encourage water to get into those basins is they do curb cuts. So basically, you have a concrete curb and you make a big divot in it, essentially, to route water into those planted basins. And then they do a heavy mulch at the bottom to increase the organic matter, which helps holds water, helps increase water infiltration, better for the plants. It helps keep things cool and moist in that southwestern desert heat. But again, that's basically a little tiny forest right there. This is a traffic circle. That's in the middle of a traffic circle right there. This is an example of like what you could do at a small scale. This is my wife Stephanie digging a basin and a small berm in someone's yard here in the Rio Grande Valley. But basically how this works most of the time, houses are a little bit up against the street, right? Because they don't want to flood. So when it rains, water comes off that roof there and it flows down. So it goes to the street. Well, if you want to encourage plants to get a little more of that water, you can slow the water from running off into the stormwater system by building a little berm and putting plants and mulch in the bottom so you increase that infiltration and trap that moisture and allow it to go down into the soil. Some cities even offer rebates to residential people to make basins to hold rainwater. So this is in Tucson. This is my older sister's backyard where they got a rebate. You can get up to a $2,000 rebate to do this in your yard, where they dug a basin, you can see all the mulch there, and then they routed their gutter system to go down into that basin, and they have some relatives. We have a lot in common with southwestern deserts. We've got about, I think it's some 30% of our woody species have some sort of affiliation with southwestern deserts. So there's some Parkinsonias in there, which is the Ratama or the Palo Verde. But what a cool idea, offering people, paying people basically to do rainwater harvesting in their spaces. Even closer to us, not quite the same thing, but a similar concept, San Antonio offers landscape coupons to tear out grass and put in native plants as a water conservation effort. So this is absolutely something that I think we should be doing here in the Rio Grande Valley. They even pay you extra if you do it at the right time of year. So this one, I saw this and I was like, Stephanie, you have to come. San Antonio is paying people to not plant in the summer, because planting in the summer is generally not the way to go. But like they're saying, basically, do your grass kill with the cutting grass, laying down cardboard. Do your bed preparation in the summer months when it's blasted hot and you don't want to be planting anyway, and then plant in the fall, and you get a little extra on top of your normal rebate. Really cool idea. So beyond doing rainwater harvesting, planting tiny forests, there's absolutely a need to preserve what we do already have, right? This is Valley Nature Center, so we are in that building there. Little patch of dense thorn forest in the midst of probably medium to light development to the south, and then heavier commercial development to the north there towards the highway. But just in that little patch, over 240 species of birds have been documented in this little area. Quinta Mazatlan, total species, over 1,000 species of plant, animal, in that small patch of forest there. So we need to preserve those spaces, and then we need to connect them. And there's a cool synergy that we could do that is already happening. This is the Hidalgo County Precinct 2 hike and bike trail. I don't know if any of y'all have gone on that. It's a really cool hike and bike trail, but they've got some nice little patches of kind of secondary growth coming up. But it's a very long hike and bike trail. And imagine the power of making spaces that are better for people to walk and ride bikes, safe for people to walk and ride bikes in our cities, but also create that habitat connectivity at the same time. Ultimately, again, sharing spaces, connecting people to people and people to ecosystems. These are students at one of the tiny forests taking some plant measurements. And then this is more of a personal thing. I'm a city person. I grew up in Edinburgh, Texas. And I fell in love with plants because I loved looking at the yard mallows in people's yards and on UTRGV campus. And I love looking at the little Tridax daisies and all the little bees that are going to those Tridax daisies. This kind of goes back to the pigeon paradox, celebrating and connecting with even the common things, building that appreciation for the world around us, the prickly pears and the mesquite trees and the grackles. There is a kind of sobering study that came out recently that what's driving bird diversity loss in the US is not loss of rare species, it's loss of common species. So we need to celebrate our common species while they're still common. Is it the American Birds Conservancy? No, it's the other one, Partners in Flight. Their motto is keep common birds common, right? So that should be a goal, absolutely. Keep rare plants around, but also keep common plants common. And this is another kind of sobering one, but also a call to action, I think. All that developed space that I showed you, that red and that pink, all of that in the 4-county region in the Rio Grande Valley equals about 800, almost 900,000 acres of land that's developed. And that is about 7 times more than the entirety of Laguna Atascosa National Wildlife Refuge. So that's a lot of space, right? And a lot of that space is grass. And a lot of that space is open and plantable. So we have 7 times the area of Laguna Atascosa to plant native plants and to connect people with wildlife and connect people with each other for something that is better for people and better for wildlife. And so I'll wrap it up here in a second. But with that in mind, what do we value and what do we choose? This is a long quote, but basically it says that in urban areas, we kind of control the plant template, right? By how we manage it, by whether we mow down things that are popping up, by what we plant in our gardens, by what we plant in our residential developments, when we're planting them, if we save trees that are already growing in those spaces, or if we clear cut everything. And then everything else, all the fungi and the insects and the birds, they come in afterwards, and we don't control them, but we do control that plant template. And so what will we choose to do with that control over the plant template? This is my wife and my yard, and we have a whole section of yard here. What we chose in this section is to have edible native plants right there. It's not just for wildlife. Our yard is also for us. And so we've got Mexican oregano, and we've got chili piquin down below it, and we've got yuccas, and we've got colima, and we've got bushy lipia, and we have Turk's cap, and shrubby blue sage, and whitebrush, and I've got ratama, and ebony, and granjeno, all in that little strip right there that goes from my backyard up to the front, probably 30, 40 feet, something like that. A lot of diversity, a lot of joy from going out and connecting with that, seeing what wildlife are using it, eating and making teas of the various plants that are there, and then getting to share it some with our neighbors at the same time and tell them why we're doing what we're doing. So we do have a website. Stephanie and I, we started Prickly Pear RGV, and if you're interested in having us look at your space and help you develop a plan on how you want to use your yard, we'd be happy to help you with that. And with that, I will go ahead and end and see if there's any questions. Yes, if anyone has any questions or comments or anything. It's bright. Yep.
I think that's a fantastic idea, the incentives of the coupons like San Antonio is doing. Would that be a big hurdle for us to try to get something like that off the ground without?
Probably. Yeah, probably. What did we find out? We found out that SAWS is the water provider for the city of San Antonio, which is interesting. And Stephanie knows way more about local water systems than I do. So if you have water system questions, yes, I'm pointing them towards my wife, Stephanie. But we have all these different water providers in the Rio Grande Valley. And there's this seems like how I would summarize it. It seems like there's a weird incentive structure, or actually that's how Stephanie summarized it, where they're trying to sell you water, not necessarily conserve that water. But then we also have to be worried about conserving water, because then they won't have water to sell, you know what I mean? So it's this weird thing. But it'd be such a powerful thing to do if you can get over that hurdle.
I have thought about that actually a while back, but because I think about the construction side of it, and I think Mike Allen has always been forward thinking with their tiny forest and the city turning up the Kinga and everything. I always thought about taking it a step further and going to zoning boards and seeing if you could offer residential and commercial coupons or discounts or cuts on permits for builders that are building things, because they're going to put something in that front strip of grass anyway. Why would it be a crepe myrtle when it could be a whitebush?
I think someone was telling me that it was the Edinburgh, not the code, but it was the development. What is it called, Stephanie? The Unified Development Code in Edinburgh was changed some point within the past few years, and that's kind of why in some of these newer businesses in Edinburgh, you do actually see a lot of native plants. One of my favorite ones, local example, if you're ever going towards the courthouse in Edinburgh, there's actually a Stripes on Sprague and Klausner. And it has really cool landscaping. I purposely like to drive by that because it's got Harry Wedelia, it's got sable palm trees. I think it has a persimmon in there. Yeah, Vicky.
The Dallas County Courthouse movement is actually landscaping.
Okay.
And I was kind of walking around this area that has a big shrub, a long ways, and I thought, that looks like Mexican oregano. So I cut off the leaf and sure enough.
That's awesome. So for those who couldn't hear, Hidalgo County Courthouse, the new one, is mostly landscaped with native plants, and they even have a big hedgerow of Mexican oregano.
Obviously, they kind of turned it to making a shrub, but it's really a real native
That's cool. Yeah.
Does Allen have a habitat ordinance or
Not that I'm aware of.
require you to mow?
Not that I'm aware of, no.
Have they ever?
I don't think so. If you look at a lot of the codes, in like if you go to Municode, that's the way to search your local code, the easiest way probably. I like to look at that, and I look up weed, and I look up like lawn and stuff to see what they have different like height restrictions, but then there's this weird vague language about like if it's uncultivated, and so like a lot of it is undefined.
Lot ordinances. They seem pretty arbitrary. I know Brownsville back in the 80s passed a habitat ordinance because they wanted to clear brush along the side. And a lot of people have a terrible idea, so they basically passed an ordinance that would allow places to be exempted from the city.
So Brownsville wanted to clear brush, but then they made an exemption to the ordinance. Okay, yeah. Yeah, that you don't want to. So just to be clear, I am not encouraging every space has to be planted like a tiny forest. That is a tool for a certain style of like habitat creation, essentially, right? So that works well if you have a big grassy space and you want to quickly turn it into a forest, right? But can't necessarily do that in your yard.
Would it eventually shoot the shelter to where
There's going to be mortality. Yeah, you're essentially. I mean, that's what happens in succession, right? Certain trees will grow, they'll compete with their other trees. Eventually, over time, different ones will thrive at different stages of the forest life. So yeah, like basically for a tiny forest, you're like, hey, all of y'all go in the deep end, play or fight with each other, and then we'll see what happens 10, 20 years down the line. But ideally, because we're putting in this like assemblage of species that are very common in the Rio Grande Valley, you'll end up with something that vaguely looks like a quinta or a McAllen Nature Center. Yeah.
We're novices. We took a yard with all weeds, and we got rid of the weeds and planted native plants from Mr. Heath's nursery. Some have died and some are okay. We planted them in late spring, early summer. And that was a mistake.
Yeah.
Say we plant in the fall now, like in October, like in a couple of weeks, and then come winter though, freezes, should we even attempt to protect the plants that we have planted in the fall, or?
When we've done planting stuff in September, October, even in November, like most of it makes it through a freeze. It might die back above ground, but a lot of times they'll have that's enough time for these plants to kind of get their roots going, get some energy storage going on, and then most of them will probably spring back, even if it's not like a crazy heavy freeze, but your average everyday or your average every winter freeze, they might die back a little bit, but most of our native plant species are able to withstand some freezes. So I wouldn't be too concerned about that. But here's the thing: if you want to protect a plant, protect a plant. You know what I mean? Like if you have a special plant that you really care about that you don't want to be hit by the freeze, go ahead and put that covering over it.
So I think some of our plants have died through overwatering because we were concerned it was too hot, and so it just kind of withered away. I think from overwatering. How do you do that?
You can kind of match. I think there's a real scientific way of doing that that's probably not very applicable, but I think probably the easier way of doing it is generally there's some online resources, there's some sources like the Native Plant Project booklets here that give you a general idea of how much water different plant species need. A lot of the stuff that I tend to favor does well in a dry to kind of medium soil moisture. I typically personally don't plant a lot of water loving stuff. That's just my personal preference. And I don't live in a really wet area where water like accumulates. But I would try to match the watering to the plant needs. We don't really water our yard very much because we're kind of lucked out with soil, and then we also plant really drought resilient plants. But when I'm typically establishing a plant, I might give it one watering per week for a few weeks after I plant it, and then just kind of let it go and do more of responsive watering if it looks like it's stressed, instead of preemptive, like on a schedule watering. Yes?
Have there been any long-term studies of tiny forests acting as kind of a reservoir where the species in that tiny forest then have an effect or spread to areas around?
Not that I'm aware of, but that could certainly be a possibility, right? Like if you have all those plants that are going to seed, going to fruit, birds are eating them, their seeds are being blown on the wind, like in theory it should be spreading into the local environment. There's a cool study that they did with birds and habitat restoration in the tropics. This is related, I promise you. But basically they put up a pole in an open space near a forest, and birds would go and land on it and poop it out. And where they put that pole versus where they didn't put the pole, you had more diversity, right? Because of the nearby forest. So that's the same. I think it's the same concept there. I'm not aware of any particular studies, but it should work. Another thing with tiny forests that's kind of cool is like because there's so many plants that are going to fruit and seed in there, like we go out there and collect seed and give it to people all the time. And y'all are welcome to go to these public ones and grab seed. Like they're public access. There's no rules about not collecting seed from there. So anyways, yeah, Ernest.
So your tiny forests involving kind of on city property or what kind of property?
Some are on MISD.
Okay. And what were your conversations like when you were kind of proposing this, and what were like their biggest concerns
Let me kind of work through mentally the different ones that we have. The ones off of Ware Road, we basically went to Parks and Recreation and we're like, hey, we have money to do a tiny forest. Can we do this spot? And they're like, okay, let's do a dig test and see if it's a suitable spot to do. Is there any underground infrastructure you have to worry about? And they're like, yeah, there is, but it's up here. So that was kind of our limiting area. And then they were basically like, go for it. And they helped us out. So that Ware Road site, it's because it's a long road, it's really compacted soil because of all the traffic going by it. So we had Parks and Rec brought out a ripper, ripped it up first. Then we put on compost topsoil and they disked it in. And so that was really helpful for Parks and Rec doing that. At the schools, we go to the principal or the school leadership and are like, hey, we'd like to do a tiny forest. Is there a spot in your school that you would envision doing a tiny forest? And they generally choose based off of, okay, is this a space that kids go to? Can they use it for their outdoor learning? For one of them, it worked out because there's already like a little trail system there. And so we were like, we can work around that. Does that answer your question?
I guess I'm just wondering, based on the other conversations we've had, people worry about snakes.
There's been very few comments about the snakes thing. And my easy answer, because we're doing these in the city, is like, if you're in developed part of Edinburgh, McAllen, like the odds of seeing a venomous snake are so infinitesimally small, right? The more pressing one that you get sometimes is the visual thing, where people are like, oh, it looks messy, right? These are all young, so how I've been describing that phase, it's usually in the first year and a half that it kind of looks messy because there's still enough light hitting. Even though we try to kill all the Bermuda grass, you can't kill all the Bermuda grass. So even though there's enough light for there to still be Bermuda grass coming up through it, so I call it the messy teenager year. But after a couple years, that canopy closes in and it shades stuff out. Does that help? Okay. Yeah.
Is the South Railroad area that y'all did, in a flood zone, and did that have any impact on your decision to build a tiny forest?
It probably is in a flood zone, but I'm not sure on that. It did not impact our decision. I know it floods further to the south of it. I'm not sure how far north on Ware Road that flooded area goes, but there's an elementary school South 23rd Street between 23rd and Ware, Roosevelt Elementary. That neighborhood floods terribly, but I don't think it's as bad once you get up to that Palm View area.
And the other question is, there's an area on the playgrounds, the former playgrounds at Crawford Elementary, on Main and La Vista, that has a really nice collection of native trees. Is that a tiny forest?
That's because of John Goolsby and I think Commissioner Haddad, or certainly because of John Goolsby.
Started with John, the other John, the former commissioner.
Oh, okay. Former Commissioner John Ingram. Oh, okay. Okay.
Started just a few, and then all of a sudden there were more trees.
Well, I know John Goolsby collects seeds of Texas ebony from the 250-plus-year-old Texas ebony tree off of, I forget what road it is, Harvey? 8th Street? No, there's that one, but then there's one close right down the street from Crockett. And he collects seed from that, and most of those ebonies are exclusively the offspring of that 250-plus-year-old tree. Any other comments, questions? Anyways, if you want to chat up afterwards, I think people are ready to go home. I do, real quick, and put my Quinta hat on, my Quinta Mazatlan hat. I did leave I thought I left a Planta Nativa flyer somewhere over there. I only brought one, just take a photo of it. But this upcoming month, we have a ton of native plant programs at Quinta. So thanks for your attention. Thanks for your patience.